From the government's handling of strained emergency rooms to the reality of recall petitions and Donald Trump's message to the Prime Minister. Time now for tonight's politics panel. And joining us this evening, Rob Breakenridge. He's a broadcaster, columnist, and host of the Line Alberta podcast. And making his first appearance on the panel, Tyler Gandam, former mayor of Wetaskiwin and former president of Alberta Municipalities. Gentlemen, good evening to you both. And Tyler, welcome to the panel.
Thanks. Good to be here.
All right. Well, let's begin with calls from the opposition to reconvene the legislature over the state of hospital emergency rooms. Calls that come as the government responds to a recently leaked list of ER deaths.
I don't feel that these anonymized cases are representative of the incredible care that our system and our frontline healthcare professionals provide on a day-to-day basis.
The hospitals minister referring to a list of 6 deaths and dozens of near misses, a list compiled by ER doctors in recent weeks. Matt Jones was in Calgary for unveiling of the new emergency room at the Peter Lougheed Centre, which will add 97 patient and 28 ER beds to the province's acute care system next month. Doctors, though, call the government's response tone deaf to the realities of severe ER shortages. Rob, is this a dialogue of such a nature where maybe Albertans should be hearing from Premier Smith? What's to be made of how the government is responding?
Well, it is interesting and notable the Premier's absence over the last few weeks, and we haven't really seen or heard from her at all, certainly not on this issue. And maybe that's a way of trying not to elevate it. I think once the Premier does come out and speak to it, I mean, it conveys the sense that this is a serious issue. And I think they've been trying to downplay it. That's becoming harder and harder to do as more of these stories come to light, not just about the overall numbers of, a system running at over 100% capacity, but, these individual, really in some cases, horrifying stories of people who have suffered and in some cases died in waiting rooms, in emergency rooms, because they're not able to be seen, and not just for 2 or 3 hours, but in some cases, 8 hours or more. So it's a system that's really at the breaking point. And look, you can point out in fairness that, other provinces are going through the same thing. It's not a uniquely Alberta problem, but it is provincial jurisdiction. It is the Alberta government's responsibility to address this. And what we've heard from the hospitals minister, Matt Jones, so far, it's just been a lot of, sort of downplaying and platitudes about, we're responding to this, we're dealing with this. They couldn't really answer the question this week about, well, how many new beds are actually under construction? So I don't know that they've done a good job explaining all of this to Albertans. And I think just back to the point, it would be important, I think, for the Premier to speak to this.
Well, Tyler, what do you make of how this conversation is evolving and maybe how it's landing with Albertans?
I was really disappointed to hear how it's being downplayed. We talk about, less than 1% of the people who attend an emergency room or an emergency department have died. Well, that's still 1,400 people. And I bet you that 1,400 families care pretty deeply about the state of what our emergency departments and our hospitals and our healthcare system are in. And I think it needs the attention from all of government, including the Premier. And I'm not a fan of the back and forth between the partisan push, whether it's Team Orange or Team Blue. I think this is an Alberta problem that we need to deal with. And for me, it doesn't matter that the rest of the country is dealing with healthcare issues. We're dealing with it here in Alberta, and it needs to be a priority.
Rob, how much value would there be in the government heeding the opposition's call to reconvene the legislature early?
Well, I mean, I think there's some politics there. I mean, it would keep it front and center during question period. I do think the NDP sense that this is a vulnerability for the government, an issue they've mismanaged, and an issue that I think Albertans are becoming increasingly concerned about. So, I mean, I don't know what would necessarily be accomplished in the legislature that the government couldn't just go ahead and do right now. But I think at the same time, some accountability is important. And I think, having the legislature sitting does provide that, having ministers on record, asking tough questions of the government in terms of what they're doing or not doing on this file. So there would be some value to that, I suppose. But in terms of actual steps taken to address that, I think there are ways that the government could respond. And, you think back a few years ago before Danielle Smith was in politics, one of her big criticisms of the Carney government or Alberta Health Services with this, they didn't just conjure up 1,000 new ICU beds in the pandemic, implying that this is easy. And I think she's learning the hard way that this is far from easy. So if you're demanding action when you're outside government, when you've got an opportunity as Premier to address this, I think it's reasonable to demand some action and some accountability here.
All right. Next up, the deadline has come and gone, and a citizen-led petition attempting to recall Education Minister Dimitrios Nicolaides has failed to secure enough signatures. Still, the Calgarian behind the effort calls it a success.
This is, to me, a tremendous success. 6,800, or call it more than 6,500 signatures doesn't tell our education minister that his constituents have an issue with the way that he's leading us. I don't know what will.
Jenny Jeremy brought a box of signatures to the Elections Alberta office in Edmonton Tuesday. More than 16,000 were needed to trigger a recall vote. That's 60% of the number of votes cast in Nicolaides' Calgary Bow riding in the last election. Tyler, having been on the other side of the coin, you know a thing or two about recall petitions. How much of an impact do you feel the more than 24 initiatives targeting MLAs will ultimately have, regardless of whether or not they meet the threshold?
I think there's going to be there'll be an impact for sure on those members who have been recalled. It brings to light a lot of what they're doing or not doing. Social media has played a big part in that as well, where you can say anything you want about anyone, especially an elected official, without any consequences or having to prove what you're saying is true. I've said from the beginning, and this was long before I was even involved with recall legislation is poor. It's at best. The fact that we have elections every 4 years is the reason why people are held to account on their actions, on their deliverables, and whether or not they were a good representation as an MLA, as a member of council. I think that that's what we need to go back to. Right now, this is a huge distraction, and it's not doing anybody any good other than just creating more problems along the way. And it creates a bigger political divide. Even at the municipal level, there is still that push on whether or not you are left or right, and that's going to be the basis on whether or not somebody signs the petition. And in a lot of cases, they don't even understand or know why they're signing the petition. So I've said from the beginning, you need to scrap that legislation and move back to letting elections decide who the representation is.
Rob, a majority of the recall petitions target UCP MLAs. How much of a win, then, will it be for the governing party if it ends up being that they all fall by the wayside?
Well, yeah, I'm sure they'll find some vindication in that. I think we knew going into this it was going to be an uphill battle for all of these petitions, given the short time to collect signatures and the high threshold for the number of signatures that are needed. It's a tall order to recall an MLA. There is the process itself, and that comes at some cost to elections officials who need to spend time verifying all of this. But yes, I think we'll see what comes of all of this. I mean, it was one thing for us to say, wow, there's a dozen now, 24, whatever it ended up being, recall campaigns. At the end of it, if they all fail, what really was accomplished? I do think, though, again, that there's still the possibility that we could see a couple of these get at least in the neighborhood of that target. And then, of course, the next step would be a recall vote, et cetera. So whether any of these are able to get across that finish line, I guess we'll have to wait and see. And the other thing is, and of course, the government has alleged that somehow this is being abused or it's not being used correctly, even though it's certainly in line with the legislation. Will we see some changes? The NDP have already said, look, we would scrap this. We don't think this is necessary. But if we're going to put some more limits or parameters around that, as maybe the Premier has now suggested, are we going to see that at some point this year?
All right. Time for us to take a bit of a break. But when we come back, Donald Trump's message to Canada at the World Economic Forum. More from our politics panel in a moment. Welcome back. The U.S. President addressed the World Economic Forum today, and of note where Canada is concerned, Donald Trump issued a warning to the Prime Minister.
Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. But they should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
Trump's comments came a day after Mark Carney told the same gathering the global political system is in the midst of a rupture, not a transition, and that rules-based international order is not coming back. The U.S. president also doubling down today on his desire to take control of Greenland, reiterating plans to seek negotiations. Rob, the Prime Minister in his address Tuesday never once made specific reference to the U.S. president, but it carried a message that garnered a lot of international support. So what's to be made of how it landed with Donald Trump?
Well, pretty much as expected. And in a way, I mean, Trump's response almost kind of confirmed some of the points that Mark Carney was making to begin with. So, you know, I mean, it validates what Mark Carney was saying, but I mean, it does show that, look, we do have an issue, or we have a challenge here where, yes, things have drastically changed with regards to the United States. And it wasn't just belligerence toward Canada. It was all kinds of belligerence towards all kind of ostensible allies in the speech at the World Economic Forum. It's interesting, too, what an important venue this has become for all of this, whereas, you know, we've seen previously in Canadian politics, you know, the Conservatives sort of playing into some of the conspiracy theories around the World Economic Forum, saying they would boycott this gathering. I think we see how important it is for Canada to be there, and in a way, how almost relevant Canada has become through this event. So we'll see what kind of follow through comes from Mark Carney's speech. I think they were important words, but if it's just a speech in Davos and nothing more comes of it, then really what was the point? But there's a lot to navigate here, both in terms of Canada stepping up and doing more when it comes to our sovereignty and Arctic security and trying to work alongside European allies. But what's going to happen, for example, with CUSMA renegotiations? What's going to happen with other aspects of our relationship with the U.S.? It does include defense, like through NORAD or potentially, you know, this missile defense system. So it's a tricky needle to thread here for the Prime Minister, but I think he's rightly called out the situation we find ourselves in, and there's not a lot of good choices moving forward here.
Tyler, how much of a turning point in the Canada-U.S. relationship could this Davos dialogue end up being with CUSMA negotiations on the horizon?
I think this was a big turning point, but we've seen a few of them already. The way that Prime Minister Mark Carney has responded with retaliatory tariffs, working with other countries like China. And I think that speech was just showing the world, as well as the United States, that we're not just going to roll over and be the United States' little brother. And so I think moving forward, it's going to be very clear, and we're going to see how President Trump is going to react and respond to Mark Carney's speech, and probably the way that the rest of the leaders responded in Davos as well, too. I'm sure that a standing ovation for the Prime Minister and not getting the love and support for the President is also going to play into that. He's talked about how the United States responds based on how they've been treated in the past. And their is their reality. And it's going to be interesting to see how they respond to both Canada and the rest of the world through the World Economic Forum. So stand by and wait to see what happens.
Well, and Rob, as we heard in the conversation with Professor Hubert off the top, Donald Trump is determined to power forward in his drive to acquire Greenland. How do you think we as Canadians should look upon this from a sovereignty standpoint?
I think it should worry us. I mean, clearly, you know, sovereignty as far as Greenland's concerned, and Denmark by extension, is of little concern to the United States. So if that sovereignty doesn't matter, to what extent does our sovereignty matter? And I think it's a troubling question that the Canadians need to confront right now. I mean, it kind of feels like we've gone back to a lot of the atmosphere that surrounded the election last year and the threats about Canada's a 51st state and the tariffs, because some of that had fallen off the agenda in recent months. But it seems like it's all back front and center once again, that with this new security doctrine, with Trump's open threats and belligerence, you know, it does feel like something has really changed here. And clearly, I think, has been alluded to, you know, just walking on eggshells and hoping for the best with Donald Trump clearly isn't a viable strategy. That the U.S. is going to do, or Trump is going to do what he wants to do or thinks he needs to do, regardless of how we react. So that's the dilemma here for countries like Canada, is you show some backbone, band together, realizing that, you know, Trump's not going to roll over either. So it is going to get bumpy. But it is really sad and really tragic, you know, to see this Western alliance, to see NATO now perhaps even potentially imperiled. At the same time, when Donald Trump is talking about the need to, you know, to have Greenland for security reasons to counter the Russia and China threat. I mean, Russia and China are just, I'm sure, loving this, with NATO being undermined and all these Western divisions unnecessarily coming to the forefront. So it's not a good time right now. And I think, you know, Mark Carney's speech does allude to some of those serious challenges.
Tyler, all of maybe 30 seconds left. To what degree should Canadian sovereignty be on the radar where the petition for a referendum on separation is concerned?
I think we're at a really troubling time right now with that divide. We're seeing right now that many Albertans and potentially the rest of Canada don't like the way that we're being governed or don't like the way that we were governed. And so it's really important right now that we try to find some common ground. And we're better off, I think, as one country and one voice and one power. And I don't know that getting the pressure from the United States or from anywhere around the world is in our best interest right now. So I think we have to be really worried about our own sovereignty, looking at the moves that the United States are making and what it's going to look like here over the next few months and coming years.
All right, gentlemen, we're out of time. Have to leave it there. Good to see you both. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.